I was suffering from mold allergy. I don't know if anybody else suffers from this, but mold allergies are psychotropic. They cause you to have hallucinations and strange mental states. Really not pleasant. And last week,
Sounds pleasant.
I felt
It's
my,
very bad. He was really sick.
I tried to disguise it, but, and I'm
Not
sure
so
I partly succeeded, but on the inside, I thought, what? So anyway, now I'm slightly more clear-headed. And I want to go back to just working through a bit of the material. And then I had a few thoughts about this issue that came up towards the end about the so-called guise of the good. And I thought that I didn't do as good a job of defending the picture that I had as I thought, because I'll try to show you how that went. I think it's kind of interesting. That'll take the first half of the class. Then the second, I want to look at a different question, one that came up in a number of the papers. I haven't read all of them yet, but I've read a bunch of them, about how we should understand some principles that Plato uses in talking about women that are deceptively simple, so it's very easy to sort of think, oh, I see what that says, whereas in fact it turns out hard to see what it says. So, I think that raises some challenges. So in a way, this is kind of a little logic class of a sort applied to strange things. So let's go back. There are two principles, the principle of qualification and the principle of opposites. And both of these are principles that apply to relations. I got a new marker, but now I can't get the lid off. There I go. Okay, so we've got two principles, the principle of opposition and the principle of qualification. And both of these are important principles, and to see their role in the argument takes a little bit of seeing. But the first is that both of these principles apply to relations. And they don't just apply to psychological relations. In a way, you might say, this is a little bit of Plato's theory of relations, and it applies and was developed by Aristotle and by the scholastics later. And so let's take a look at how we do it. So we've got that's the general form of things to which these apply, right? Else A is related to B by some relation R. And what the principle of opposites tells us is that if A is related by R to B, right, then that entails that it's not the case that A is related by not R to B. And just how we fiddle with the negations isn't going to matter very much. So the thought is this, right? I can't simultaneously stand in a certain kind of relation, or my soul can't stand in a certain kind of relation to this, and in the contrary or opposite relation to it. And then we get a bunch of little writers in the same way, in the same respect, at the same time. Right? To get rid of certain kinds of apparent counterexamples, like a person is standing still and waving their arms, aren't they both moving and standing still? No, right? We get a few clarifications to get us away from the kind of simple counterexamples. And we looked at, so let's take the case where R is a psychological relation. So this could be, just to keep it simple, it could be a belief, or it could be a desire. And there's a general problem with applying, so these are so-called intentional, and then we get a little bit of stuff you like, philosophers like intentional with a T and intentional with an S. And intentional with the T is just the intentionality of psychological relations, that they're directed to something, and sometimes it's out of the thing they're directed to needn't exist. So there's the intentional inexistence of something. So when you're looking for the fountain of youth, right, you desire the fountain of youth. There is no fountain of youth, but that's what's leading you off to travel around in Brazil, up the Amazon River, where you will be shot by the local people with their bows and arrows, and you still won't find the fountain of youth. Intentional with an S is a feature of sentences or propositions, and they're sometimes tried to bring them into a relationship with one another, and we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to look at a few examples and get the feel for the distinction. So the obvious one is Oedipus desires to marry Jocasta. Oedipus does not desire to marry his mom. But 3 Jocasta equals, or is it equal to, I should say, his mom. So that should, apparently by the principle of opposition, that should lead us to the view that Oedipus is not one thing, right? It should lead us to the view that Oedipus, one part of Oedipus stands in the desiring to marry relation to Jocasta, and another part of him stands in the desires not to marry to his mother, right? So if we took Plato to be arguing like this, right, then we would have to say that his argument is invalid. And why is that? Well, that's because we take the context, as we call it, that's this bit, that's the context, as we say. We take or rather, that's the relation. It creates a context, that's this. And these contexts are opaque. You can't substitute identities in them. And that's just what that shows you, right? Because he does desire to marry Jocasta, and he doesn't desire to marry his mother, and the reason there's no inconsistency is that you can't, right, do this, you can't quantify in, you can't say there exists an X such that Oedipus desires to marry X, and there exists a Y such that O doesn't desire to marry Y, and X is equal to Y. You can't do that. You can't quantify in and pull out a variable and then say, hey, there's this, as we say, open sentence, desires to marry, right? And it's satisfied by one thing, both it and its negation. That's a contradiction. So what we say is, these contexts are intentional. They don't allow for substitution. You can't substitute X for Y in this. You can't substitute mom for Jocasta. These are intentional contexts. This is all part of the lingo of getting clear about this. As our right desire belief, they create intentional contexts. And one of the explanations for that is often put this way: you desire things under a description. Right? It's not this. Oedipus desires to marry that, and he doesn't desire to marry that. He desires to marry this under the description Jocasta, or this babe in front of me, and not under the description mom, right? And so, just as we do with intentional actions, right, where I intend to kick Jocasta, I don't intend to kick my mother, right? And so when I ask, did you intentionally kick your mother, the answer is no. Why? Because I intended to kick someone under the description Jocasta, not under the description of my mother. You know, this is all part of the way of thinking that these psychological relations, in fact, is the way we characterize them. And some people do it this, they say, like when the name of the psychological relation gives a rise to an intentional with an S context, that's because it's an intentional with a T phenomenon. So here are your desires, your beliefs, your intentions, and a bunch of other stuff. What makes them all psychological in the right sense? They're all things that when you express them, you have to express them with intention. Okay. So this would be an objection, right? This is objection to P's argument for dividing the soul. Why? Well, because you don't have to divide Oedipus, right? You don't solve this problem this way. There are two parts to Oedipus. One desires to marry his mother, the other desires to marry Jocasta, and that's why it's true. You solve it by saying these relations are intentional, and so you can't substitute identities in them. And so he doesn't stand in opposite relations to the same thing, right? That's how you solve it. So if we, and for a while, you know, you can imagine, bliss was it in this dawn to be alive, right? When people found this nice little theory about intentional relations, read Cross and Woosley, which used to be the standard kind of book on the Republic, and they say, "Pa! End of Plato, goodbye. We don't have to worry about that anymore, how primitive, how sophisticated we all are." And then but of course philosophy catches up with everybody. And next up was really Quine and David Kaplan. I'm sure you've all read all these things. If you remember Kaplan's Divat, I don't know if you, but so the thought is, no, there's a way to reach out to the world, even with your mind, that isn't under a description. Just as you can touch things, you don't touch the chair under a description. You're hammering this thing, whatever it's described as, right? You're hitting it, touching it, however it's described. In the same way, you can reach out with your mind and touch things, and touch them, as it were, regardless of how they're described. And so what Quine discovered was there are two ways of representing belief. One is attributively, and the other is referentially. This is the way Quine put it. So we've got attributive belief, and attributive belief creates intentional contexts. When I believe that there are spies, right, it's an attributive notion. It's not that there's someone that I believe is a spy. It's just that I believe that in fact there are spies. But do I believe of you that you're a spy? No. Or you? No, I don't believe of anybody that they're a spy. But I believe that there are spies, right? So believing that there are spies, as Quine puts it, doesn't interest the FBI, right? Believing of someone that he is a spy does interest the FBI. And so that's the attributive, but we've also got referential belief. And so this one is represented by believe that, roughly speaking. These are crude, but I do. Believe that and believe of. So if I believe that Ortcut is a spy, and Ortcut is Smith, I don't believe that Smith is a spy. Why? Well, because I can't substitute identities. So if I believe that, I won't because we've already gone off. If I believe that A is a spy, right? I can believe that. So I believe that A is a spy, and I believe that, or I don't believe it. I believe that B is not a spy. I can believe both of those things, right? Even though A is identical to B. So here's the famous one, right? Cicero and Tully, they're the same person. Both are Roman orator. But a lot of people don't know Tully is another name for Cicero. And so I can believe that Cicero was a Roman orator and not believe that Tully is a Roman orator, even though Cicero is Tully. So I believe that creates an intentional context. But now look at it this way. I believe of Cicero that he is a Roman orator, right? Well, but that guy is Tully. So I also believe of Tully that he is a Roman orator. How is that? Well, think about it this way. When I believe of this guy that he's a Roman orator, he comes to have a certain property. The property of being believed of by Reeve to be a spy, and he has that property under any description of him, right? That's the way the things work out.
In that example, do you know that Cicero and Tully are the same?
No. So the point is, yeah. So the point is that if the contexts were transparent or not referentially opaque, then I can quantify into them. I can pull out. So I can substitute identities. So what would follow is, if you believe that Cicero is an orator, and Cicero is Tully, then I can pop in Tully as an orator, right?
Yeah.
And that's true regardless of what you believe about Tully. So you're quite right that in your epistemic world, right, Cicero and Tully are not the same, right? But if I make them the same because you do believe that they are the same, then I can substitute identities, but it's only because I'm doing it now in a world that permits it.
It just seems strange to say that Tully would also have the property of you believing him to be
so think of it this way, right? Here's this guy, and he stands in a certain relation to you. What relation? Well, you believe him to be a Roman orator. So he's got that property, regardless of how he is described. So he's Tully, he also has that property. But of course I can't report it this way, that you believe that Tully is a Roman orator. It's only true that you believe of him that he is. So Quine thought, with some justification, right, that you should distinguish these two. So if we do, and we now take referential belief, right, we can't you can't get around Plato's argument by using referential belief. And in fact, if you look at the way that Plato works on the principle of opposites, it's like this. Thirst is for this very thing, right, perceptually presented to me, right? Right, it's this very thing, I could touch it, this, right? And I both want to drink it, and I don't want to drink it. There's no opacity, no room for under a description. There's not like that at all. It's that here's you've got somebody, a thirsty person, who's not willing to drink this very thing, water that's in front of him that he knows is water and so on, and he says no to his thirst, right? That's the way the examples are set up. So now the argument was back on the table again, right? It says, okay, I've got around this objection, right? I don't have to worry about intentional contexts. They don't create a problem for Plato. So we can get rid of that objection. We don't have to worry about it. But now there's a different one, and this is the one we spent a bit of time on last time. I didn't think I presented it as clearly as I could, since I couldn't see it as clearly as I do. That is to ask, can't we use the same principle, same argument, to divide what for Plato is unity, namely appetite? So can't we just utilize the same principle of opposition and not, right, we've given him the principle, but can't we use it now to divide something he doesn't want to divide, namely appetite? So he wants to divide the soul, and he wants to divide it into 3 parts, not 103 or 1,003. And in particular, he doesn't want to divide appetite into a whole lot of parts. He wants it to be a unified part of the soul. Something that, from the psychological point of view, there's a reason to recognize as a unity. So in your psychological theorizing, you're going to recognize this as a special kind of thing in the soul. That's what he wants to do. So can't we So now that's objection number one. And objection number two is this. So why can't I divide appetite? So here's the story, right? A has an appetitive desire thirst, in particular thirst, for this drink. A has an appetitive aversion for how does that go? So he's got an appetitive desire. He's got a thirst for this very drink here in front of him. Right? No question about intentional stuff. He's got an appetitive desire for this drink X. And he's got an appetitive aversion for that very same drink. How come? Well, X is sweet drink, right? And that's what he wants. Right? Sorry, hot drink. He wants hot drink. He's averse to sweet drink. Right? So this one is hot. This one is sweet. But it's not this. It's not that he wants the sweetness and wants the heat, right? He wants this very drink, right? And he's both aversion, what is that? Averse, that's the word I was looking for. Averse to it, and he desires it, right? Okay? And the question is, how can he do that? Why doesn't that split appetite into two? It seems that he can do that, right? So here's I'm thirsty, the only drink available to me is this very one. It's hot, yum. It's sweet, yuck. And what happens? Why don't I split appetite? And the thought that I wanted to utilize by way of solving this, I brought all these colored markers, I'm determined to use them. In this case was, right, how do I get around this? Well, I can form a compromise. I form a compromise of appetite. And the compromise appetite is, right, it's a weaker version, since I do drink, it's a weaker version of my desire, right? So the thought is, well, damn, it's the only hot drink, right? God, it's sweet, but I'll gag it down. And if you want to explain why I'm gagging it down, I need to appeal to both of these things to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. Why aren't I just enjoying the hot drink because it's sweet, yuck, right? And in the same way, it may be, look, they may be of equal strength, in which case I may get a kind of Bourdain's ass-like toing and froing, in which I both pick it up and then I put it down, and then I pick it up, and then I put it down again, and right? If we know that kind of thing, when I can't actually leave it, and I can't actually drink it either, I stay in this kind of pull to and fro, because my aversion and my desire are just about of equal strength, and then sometimes something just happens, right? And I either drink or I throw it away in disgust, or I pour it out, or like something like that. And in each case, in order to explain why I go through this complex set of behaviors, I have to say, tell a little story like this. But those kinds of stories are available, and it's very common that we get a conflict like this. And we can extend it to beyond, this is a case where I have a thirst and I have an aversion. We can also extend it to conflicts of different kinds of appetites, hunger and thirst and sexual desire. In each of these cases, there's possible not this, right? So what's revelatory about the conflict-producing cases, the one that split the soul, is that no compromise is possible. And then we ask, why is no compromise possible? We get a little story like this, because, say, the rational desire has already said absolutely no to the appetite. It's taken its desire into consideration, but excluded it. So the case being one like where the doctor has said you mustn't drink anything at all, the reason says, I see you're thirsty, but that's not a reason to drink anymore, because the overwhelming way is not to drink, so I exclude it. And in a case like this, sipping is not forming a compromise. It's violating the absolute prohibition. Reason doesn't say, well, just a sip. That's okay. It says absolutely none. And you get the same kind of conflict with spirit and appetite, right? And why? Well, because, and now here comes the answer, reason and spirit are good sensitive, and appetite isn't. Okay? That's the story. Now we've moved, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so just a couple of questions about the appetite and reason sort of bifurcating case. So why not think that reason's desire, or reason's aversion, is for the not good, and then you can compromise by, and thirst's desire is for drink, and then you can compromise them for not good drink. Why is reason's already
good,
not good drink? I mean, you might think that that's one of the distinctive things about reason, is it's very general and that kind of thing, rather than already being specific.
So see if I got the question right first. So is the thought that why can't reason be for the not good?
Right.
Well, it could be. In which case, then you'd get conflicts the other way, right? So the thought would be appetite has an aversion to drinking.
No, sorry, what I meant was why can't reason's aversion just be to the not good rather than the not good drink? Because
okay,
and
so,
then we could find a compromise.
So
not have the bifurcation.
So the thought is that reason's sensitivity is to the overall good of the agent.
Right.
And the judgment is that any drinking would be contrary to the overall good of the agent. So the good drink is not like this 20-year-old scotch. That's good drink, right? No, this is drink that's good for you, right? So the thought is, that's how the division is constructed, right? It says, well, look, think of the case of Odysseus and the serving maids, right? His aspirated spirited desire, right, for his honor says, kill them all right now. And reason says, no, you won't succeed if you try now. Wait till later, and then you'll be able to kill them. And the suitor says, well, oh, that'll be even better. And so he says, okay, no. And the thought is, oh, what's going on in a case like that? What's going on is Spirited's desire to reestablish his own social thing is blind to certain other aspects of the situation that reason calculates about and says, no, you'll do better if you wait. And so that's how the thought is, there are things that looking to remember we're in a eudaimonistic world, right? The only motives we have to do anything are self-interested eudaimonistic motives. And that means that all of our psychological apparatus operates eudaimonistically, so to speak. And then, right, that's how we get the thought about what the rational desires objects are. Does that?
Yeah, that helps.
Okay, good. So let's take a, go ahead.
So I have another question about why, maybe I'm not understanding this, but it seems that the example Taylor is one in which compromise is not possible, right?
Say again?
The example that he has with the
yes.
is one in which compromise is not possible.
Yes.
But why does that show there are only, like the partition is just
That's a very good question. Absolutely. So we've got the principle that keeps the splitting under constraint, right? The constraint being, right, well, it's when, now I'm going to speak a different language for a second, but really there's something second order about one of the desires, right? Or a higher order about one of the desires, like it can be any order, right? But it's not first order. Right, there's something about that and the other desire being not like that gets us the conflict. But it's quite open for us to say that, well, so there are the whole good, there's the part good, the spiritual desire, which looks at one aspect of our good. Oh, there are other psychological things that look to other aspects of our good, right, that aren't the spiritual ones, right, some other aspect, in which case we would get another principle for division, right? So I think that's right. So what we want to do is we want to avoid just infinite splitting, because there's nothing interesting about that, right? We don't need parts of the soul for that. We just need psychological attitudes, right? We don't need them to cluster. The clustering comes from this feature of their objects, right? That some of them have a certain good in them, and that's what pulls them together. And here's the way it does it. I'll show you. So this, I didn't bring this up properly last time. Let me do it now. So what we want to do is, all right, let's take the case first, and we'll work backwards towards, in this case it's easier to start with reason, and work backwards towards appetite. Okay, so let's start with reason. So let's take a look at what a rational desire looks like. So here's rational. It's a rational desire. D, what does it look like? Well, look at its object. And it has as its object, Plato says, the good of all three parts of the soul. So it sort of, as we'd say, it's for the overall good of the soul, considered as a complex whole. So it isn't this way, right? It doesn't say, hey, never mind about appetite, right? And it doesn't say, never mind about spirit, it's just me, me, me. It says, no, look at all of these things that the soul wants, and how do I best satisfy all of those? Okay. So it looks at all three parts. So its object is the good of reason, the good of spirit, and the good of appetite. Well, that means that there's got to be something like the good. Yeah.
But is the object the good, the overall good for the is the object the overall good of the soul, or for things that are overall good for the soul?
Yeah.
Because
in
the drink case, it's meant to be for not good drink.
Yeah.
You know, it's an aversion to not good drink. It seems like it's directed at a specific thing.
So here's the way to think of it. It's for those things that would be good for the soul. Thank you. Yeah, that's it, the way. So good here means, right, when I'm thinking about the world, I've got this kind of measuring stick that reason uses, right? And that's for the overall good of the soul. And then I want things when they measure up appropriately, and I don't want them otherwise.
Right.
Yeah. So now, in the case of this, right, what we'd say is, well, rational D is a single desire, insofar as this is a single object. So if it's many objects, if there's a good of reason and a good of spirit and a good of appetite, but there's no putting them together, right, then in a way there's nothing to represent as the one desire that's for the good of the soul, because, right, there are three separate goods. So unity here goes back to unity here. If there's no unity here, there's no way to represent this as a single desire. It's just like an appetite for food versus an appetite for drink, right? There's no, so here's what Plato thinks, right? So it's not that by nature just this is a unity for a unified object. It's that you can so socialize this that there is a single object that will satisfy it. That is, these needn't pull apart. They can all be brought into harmony right? They can all be brought into harmony through socialization, education, and so forth. So the achievement of psychological unity is an achievement. And it doesn't mean that we're all so unified. This is an achievement. Now, in the same way, we can make a very similar argument about a spirited desire. Right? So why is there such a thing as the spirited part of the soul is in a way, why is there a single object for spirit? And the answer is that your social status, your standing in a certain social world can be one thing. It can be all the different aspects bearing on your social status can be brought into one place, right? And to that degree, spirit can be represented as a single thing urging you towards the good of that. Yeah.
So in the person who's not had the benefit of being socialized in the
Yeah.
bliss, do they have sort of more psychic parts than 3?
I think a good way to think of it is this. They don't have more psychic parts than 3, and the reason they don't is because the emergence of a part requires the unification of these things into one. So it's just,
okay.
Previously as he says, same thing about cities. He says it's not one, an oligarchy is not one city, it's 2, one of the rich and one of the poor. Why? Because you can't harmonize those things. So a way to think of it is these parts congeal, right, into parts. These attitudes that congeal into parts, provided that there is this kind of unity of purpose. And so the thought here would be, you could be such that you had a fragmented spirit. There'd be spirited desires, but there wouldn't be a spirited part of you, because there's no unity. Okay, so that's yeah.
Maybe I misheard. You said before, reason and spirited desires are both good sensitive.
Yeah.
You didn't mean that spirited desires are completely good sensitive.
No, I meant they're part good
Parts,
sensitive.
okay.
So I culled out of the overall good the notion of your sort of good as a social individual, which is the kind of thing you see Odysseus caring about is honor. How do other people see it? And that's very important. That's a very important part of our good, right? But there's more to it. Sometimes we should sacrifice that in order to do something else. Yeah.
So I'm still confused why a fragmented, spirited part of your soul doesn't come into something else. This was the very last thing you said before that.
Yeah.
I'm not understanding.
So I think the thing is, could we recognize, what causes us to need to recognize a spirited part? And that is, it's the unification of spirited desires around a single object. Now, you could tell me something like this. Can't we imagine 2 partitions in the spirited part, right? So one might be your social status at school, and the other would be your social status at the mall with your friends. And let's suppose they're just 2 separate groups altogether. So here there's a kind of pull, right? You could be pulled in 2 different directions, depending. Now, if you probably have this experience with friends. I mean, some people like to partition their friends, right? They keep this friend and these friends. And with these friends, they're this way, and with those friends, they're that way. And we don't like the 2 of them together because they don't know how to be those 2 ways with this group, and they get pulled in different directions. And then you might think, look, that's kind of like two parts to spirit. And the answer would be yes, but notice there's something else we can say. They could form a compromise, and one of the ways they could do it would be by achieving kind of greater insight into unity and life, right? So the thought would be, there too, maybe we would recognize a split. This would be like abnormal psychology, right? Your spirit is split. Why? Well, for these reasons. Could it be unified? Yes, it could. Would that be better? Yes, it would. Why? And then we...
Well, I guess I still don't see why. So why doesn't this break off into an entirely different type of thing, right? So one of the ways you see is that, look, you have your split in there, and then you have this thing that's colored, in my head it's colored blue, it's blended, right?
Yeah.
You can chop it up in
Well,
other pieces, but it's all blue, and
Yeah, yeah.
you should mix it all together.
Okay, so I think here are the constraints. Not to say that ingenuity should be utilized to see if it may just be a way of discovering, so that, elements of where there's more work to be done to get the machinery to work. The thought would be, first bear in mind the eudaimonistic nature of this little engine you were talking about, so that it doesn't divide up in things that have nothing to do with the good at all, right? And then ask yourself, in what ways could you recognize, first of all, things that are different, and then things that can be brought into unity. So the overall good gives us the desired unity, and then partial goods give us the desired, right, difference in the good sense of it between the ones that are for the overall good and the ones that are just for part good, right? The kind of good that's less than that, but still a recognizable unity. And I think the thought would be, well, spirit gives us an obvious one with real social psychological significance. Could there be others? I don't want to rule it out. I think it'd be up to you to say, yeah, you could, and here's how you do it. And then the thought would be, okay, so we need more machinery, or we have to look again. Right? So I think that's right, yes.
Remember Tamar Gindler,
Yeah.
who adds associations there?
Sorry, say what?
Tamar Gindler, she
Yeah.
added, the paper was on
Yeah.
associations
Yeah.
added to the spirited. I remember that.
Associations being in this social groups
Right,
of various
so-
kinds. Yeah, so that would be like the two groups of
Yeah, yeah,
friends, yeah. Good. Okay, so now I want to get to appetite. And curiously, appetite is the weird one, right? Because while this is, right, good of the person, this one is part good dependent. Appetite is good blind. It's not, it shouldn't be characterized as being for good of anything. So when we get to appetite, appetitive desire A, right, it's not, I shouldn't put that, it's not that it's not good dependent, it's not good. Now, let me just say a little bit about that before we jump on up. The idea here is a little bit complicated because appetite is itself complicated, right? So we're looking at the native, what does it take to be an appetite, right? We know that unities can be introduced into appetite by socializing, but they're never for a unified object. They're only for a means to the object. So you can introduce a kind of pseudo-unity into appetite by getting them all to work together for money. But you can, of course, make them into a proper unit because food, drink, and sex are different things. And you can't unify them. You can't satisfy one with the other. There's no way to do that. So appetite itself, no matter how much you socialize it, can't have that kind of unity, namely that it aims at one object. It can only have a reduced form of it, namely that it can aim at something that's a single means to satisfying all of them, the idea being that you can buy all of those things. Okay, now I want to, it's in relation to the not good dependence that now I'm going to get a new color. Right, it's here. So far, right, we've been looking at, all of this stuff about the vision of the soul and all of this. This is all a principle of opposites, right? Principle of qualification, right, now comes in here, right? So all of the apparatus that the principle of qualification is going to be to get you to see that appetite should be characterized as not good dependent. That's the whole raison d'etre of it. It's to persuade you, and it's to do it not by question-begging psychological theorizing, which often happens in this area. Some of it we were doing ourselves, I think, in our discussion. It's very easy to think that you're mutually doing something when in fact what you're doing is making presuppositions. And then it's even hard to see that you're making them because you're making them, right? That's the thought I have. And we'll come back to that in a second. So this is part of the theory of relations, and that's the way it's presented, right? So the theory, what does the principle of qualification do? Okay, so now we want to go over here and take a look at what the principle of qualification does, quite independently of looking at appetite. So again, this is logic, right? So here's what the principle says. It says, suppose that we've got A, R, B. Then, if that's so, then if I modify B, I'm going to have to modify R. So the claim is that for some way of getting at B, like some kind of object of a relation, if I qualify or modify or do anything to that object, I'm going to have to qualify the relation too. So now we have to ask, what are these objects that have this magical property? Because look, they're not the material object of the relation. So here's the drink, right? I'm thirsty. The drink stays the same. I'm very thirsty. The drink doesn't get bigger, right? So modifying my thirst doesn't modify the material object. What about the intentional object? So if I modify the intentional object, do I have to modify the relation? So, and the answer there is, well, it depends, right? So if I suppose that I modify the intentional object, so it's Oedipus wants to marry Jocasta, and I modify the Jocasta, right? So let's suppose that I make Jocasta longer haired, right? Do I have to modify the relation? No, it's not. It might be that he wants to marry her no matter what length her hair is. So modifying the intentional object doesn't necessarily modify the relation, right? Yes, it's just, they seem to be, sometimes it would, right? But there's no rule to it, right? There's no logic to it. Might or might not. But these are cases, and here's the examples that Plato gives. So first, these are not, so R is not restricted to psychological relations. So here's what he says, right? Let's look at some of the examples. So, says, so A is bigger than what? Right. And Glaucon and Adeimantus obligingly tell him it's bigger than the smaller. And he says, and A is much bigger than what? Than the much smaller. And A is going to be bigger than what? Than the going to be smaller. So they're learning to whistle a tune, right? And he says, so, and I got you to whistle part of it, right? Last time. So what does something, so if I want to divorce something, so I want to stand in the divorcing relation to something, what relationship must I stand into now? The married to it relation. If I want to, right, if I steal something, what relation did it have to have before I stole it? It had to be related to somebody, right? You sort of see how it goes. Now, what are you doing? Well, what you're saying. And so every time I modify the R, I modify some object. Now, what is that object? Let's call these objects the objects that satisfy this, the principle of qualification, right? Let's call objects of R's that satisfy the principle of qualification are, and this is, right, they're proper or natural. Plato uses the natural. He says, isn't drink by nature related to, isn't thirst by nature related to drink? And right, much thirst for much drink, and now it's, they don't, the modification doesn't have to be the same. So, and then a certain kind of thirst for sweet drink, and a certain kind of thirst, right? So, right, the mere, unless you tell me how the thirst is modified, right, I don't know what the kind of drink it's for. But it may not, but it's going to be somehow qualified if the thirst is. But if the thirst is unqualified, it's just for drink. That's the thought. And now what are those? So those are the proper or natural objects. What are the proper or natural objects? Well, the proper or natural object, the best way to think of them is that they're properties. And the proper object of a relation is a property that the object of the relation, the proper object of a relation is a property that something must have if it's to be possible to stand in R to it. So it would be something like this. What property must X have if it's to be possible to stand for Y to stand in R to X. What property must something have for it to be possible to stand in a relation to it? All this is spelled out in Philosopher King, so you don't really have to write it down. But going through it helps. So the thought is something like this, right? There are features that things must have if it's to be possible to stand in relations to them. So for example, you can't stand in the relation of divorcing to someone who isn't your spouse, right? You can't, you can't stand in the relation of stealing to something that isn't somebody else's property. You can't, and then it goes on, right? You can't stand in the relation of being much bigger to something that isn't much smaller than you are. You can't stand in the relation of going to be bigger to something that isn't going to be smaller. And you just keep tracking a certain kind of modal relation to figure out. So, and of course we know there is a trivial one, namely the arable. In order to stand in R to something, it must be an arable thing, something you can modal stand in R to. So now, right, the thought is this, right? This is not psychology. You're being asked to consider what is the proper object of thirst? And what makes thirst thirst rather than, say, hunger? And the thought here is that if your desire is thirst, then the thing it's for must be drink. Right? If you're hungry for something, the thing you're hungry for must be food. Notice the way it goes. It's not this, right? It's not that you think it's food or that you think it's drink. It's rather that, something like this, were it to turn out not to be drink, you wouldn't be thirsty for it. So you've probably had that experience of thinking that one of those damn glasses that they look like they've got beer in them, but actually they don't. And it's a candle or some damn thing. Right, and you pick it up, and you don't think, oh, well, I'm going to drink it anyway, right? The thought is, right, it's a norm. This possibility is, I think, a good way to put it often is norm-driven. So in some cases, of course, it's not norm-driven. The basis of the possibility is not norm-driven, but in other cases it is. The thought is the correct object, right? The thing properly thirsted for is drink. So now let's suppose we accept the story. That is, and notice nothing has been said about psychological relations in particular. This is true of all relations, just like the principle of opposites is true of all relations. So in that sense, I'm going to say it's psychologically naive or psychologically uninvested, right? It's not looking to psychology and hoping to get out some stuff. So let me think of it this way. Remember what Russell said about solutions to the liar paradox. He said most solutions to the liar paradox are of this sort. If you'd never known about the liar paradox, you would never have accepted anything like this. That is, they're knowing, right? They look at the liar paradox and they think, how am I going to avoid that, right? They're not this way. Here's a perfectly natural way to do things, and it avoids the liar paradox. That would be ideal, right? That's the way it should be. It should be that you don't gerrymander your solution. Your solution is motivated by something else worth being motivated by, and then it solves the liar paradox. And in the same way here, in order for us not to be subject to the claim that we've just stacked the deck, we have to motivate our view about appetite independently of our psychology. In the same way we can motivate spirited desire because we can characterize this as, right, having a natural object too, and the same for a proper object as well. Okay, so one more step and then we'll take a little break. So if we're there, right, we recognize that at the base level, before appetite is socialized, we get rid of lawless, unnecessary ones, and we're motivated only by necessary ones, so that now there is an element of good relatedness in appetite. But just unstructured, unsocialized appetite, right, is just for what, as he says, it's in its nature to be for, right? And that's, in the case of thirst, something like drink. Okay, now, what do we get if we get this? Well, what's the payoff? So when we go over to try to explain weakness of will, we get a very natural explanation. Right? So here's the principle that governs weakness of will. It's just not in human nature to go for what you believe to be bad, or to go for what you think is the lesser of two goods, or the greater of two evils. That's just not in human nature. I'm going to put it this way. That's a principle of rational agency. It's analytic of rational agency that you don't go for the lesser of two goods or the greater of two evils. You just don't. And the natural thought then is, well, how can there be weakness of will? And what Socrates says is, well, there can't. There's a phenomenon that looks like weakness of will, but it's just a failure to measure the good correctly. So something like this, you go for the lesser good over the greater one because, right, it's closer, and so you measure it wrong. You think that this immediate pleasure is bigger than that one down there because this one is closer, but if you were measuring correctly and adjusting for perspective, you wouldn't do that. So all of them are actually intellectual mistakes. It's not this. You know which is better and you go for it. It's just an intellectual mistake of failure to measure correctly. If we had the correct measuring device, we'd have salvation, right? We'd never do that. And what Plato says is, well, Socrates is right. It is a principle of rational agency that you don't go for things. And in that sense, and this is where we were arguing about guys of the good, right? But this is the right way to put it. Agents, rational agents, operate under the guise of the good. They do it in just the way I described, right? They go for the greater of two goods and not for the lesser. And they do desire things under the guise of the good. That's about rational agents. It's not about the elements in their psychology. So I got in this argument with you, and we realized that it's actually quite difficult to give a justification for the principle, right, of the guise of the good, right, unless you're wheeling in some things that can look question-begging. I think the right way to go is actually, I should just give you the principle. So you're absolutely right. That rational agents do operate that way. And that is the way we operate. We always, when we go for something, we do so because we think it's good. But that's about how psychological elements in our psychology operate together with all of our other psychological capacities to guide agency. It's not about how those individual elements in our psychology should themselves be characterized. So here's the thought. What happens when I act in a weak-willed way? Well, nothing in me goes for anything other than the good. That's the first thing that's true. There's nothing that's going for the bad or the lesser of two evils. What's true is there's something that's just going for drink, which in these circumstances happens to be bad. Right? And when I judge rationally that I should not drink, this one is stronger. And it overwhelms my judgment, and it causes me to drink. Now I have drunk in a weak-willed way, but I satisfy all of the principles of rational agency, right? It's not true that I go for what I believe to be the lesser good. I don't. Thirst doesn't motivate me to go for any good. It motivates me to go for drink. And so it can conflict with my overall judgment, or indeed other elements that are good relative, like Leontius's desire not to look at the boys as pale as corpses, right? That's just spirited desire, right? But it can be overcome by his desire to look at the corpses, which is not good relative. It's simply a sexual desire for something, and we have to say exactly what it is. I don't think I want to. Right, it's some bizarre sexual desire, and it's not as if it's good relative or good indifferent or good, it's just for that. So the theory, and here's the, if you go to Plato and you say, hey, wait a minute, why should I think that there are things like that in me? Why isn't Socrates right? Even your appetites, every one of these psychological elements in you is actually measuring a good and is sensitive to the good it measures, so that it's all the measurement theory back again. And I think Plato will say, well, here's my answer. It's not about psychology, it's actually about the logic of proper objects. And if I can motivate this, I've got an argument to offer you that haven't got anything to do with psychology at all. And therefore, right, it stands on its own 2 feet as something I can, like the principle of opposition, that I can bring into psychology, that I don't have to provide a psychological argument. So that's my thought. Let's stop there, and then we'll come back afterwards